Vicky here. I'm here today to do my Book of the Month review for October. It is Gilded Cage by Vic James. I had never heard of this book before I received it as part of my book subscription with Willoughby Bespoke Book Club. However, after looking into it, I was pretty excited about the book because it was both fantasy and alternate history, two things that I usually really enjoy. And I enjoy reading together, although I haven't read a lot like that, where the two are intertwined really nicely. This book itself follows multiple perspectives, mostly teens, kind of through their changing circumstances and kind of their everyday lives. And with that, I'm just going to go into the plot and talk a little bit about that. First, I'm going to talk about the pacing. It was pretty varied. It started off, the prologue was just like bumping along, and then the first couple chapters of the actual story slowed right down like you ran into a wall. I think part of that is because the prologue was so kind of high, because the prologue was so high octane. However, it did speed up a little bit as we moved toward the climax of the book. However, I found the pacing to be pretty inconsistent between perspectives. Some perspectives, the pacing was good, the story moved along really well. In other perspectives, not a lot happened, and it really felt like it dragged. Like I said, the introduction to the main plot was slow, especially compared to how fast and intense the prologue was. Although it made the book a little bit harder to get into because the pacing was slower, I did enjoy that despite being slow, you were learning about the world as the character was interacting with it rather than just getting info dumps, which I always hate reading. And from here, we're going to jump to kind of like story progression. As I mentioned, it starts with a really intense prologue, and then the beginning of the book it's dramatic, but not really action-packed. The premise of the book is that people who don't have skill or magic have to serve a set number of years as slave days, where they're unskilled, unpaid laborers for people who have skill or for companies they own to produce goods they need, that kind of thing. And so that's the starting premise. And as you move along, you find that people aren't really okay with this, and some of the perspectives explore revolution and rebellion. And I think the plot itself moves forward really nicely because of this, especially with the two perspectives. Luke, where you get the slave, like a really good idea of the slave days and what kind of toll that takes on the people. And then you talk with, I believe you say her name, Bauda, but I don't know. I've never seen it before, so I have no idea how to pronounce it. And she is definitely a bit more of the political side with the skilled population, and they're both very interesting, and I think they did the best at moving the plot forward. Whereas I didn't care for Abby's perspective as much. I felt like not as much was accomplished each chapter of hers that I read. And I think the book overall had really good progression, especially for a series starter, since you had, as the plot got deeper, the stakes got higher. And like your understanding of the world became a lot more concrete. And because of how it was executed, you ended up getting like a really nice cliffhanger for the second book, which I can always appreciate. With that, I'm just going to summarize a few pros and cons with the plot. One pro for me was that the pacing did pick up as the book picked up and as you became more familiar with the world, because even though it started slow, the pacing itself, it ended up not dragging as badly as I was worried it would. However, the con with this is that the pacing was kind of inconsistent between the different perspectives you explored. So you could go, a handful of chapters that very quickly, but then you'd get a couple of Abby in a row, and it didn't go as quickly and wasn't as enjoyable in my opinion. My next pro is that the story progresses really nicely. You don't have any like glaring loopholes or dead ends that are going to have to be written around, and that you get really consistent exposure to the world because of how the story's written. And for me, the con with the story is that While the first, you'd get chunks of chapters that felt really purposeful and would do a lot of story progression, you'd also end up with a bunch of chapters that just felt like filler or fluff, where you didn't get as much of the actual plot out of it. And because of this, I felt the story itself was flailing a bit by the time it reached the climax and became more directed again. Just some things to keep in mind if you're looking to pick up the book. And with that, I'll go from plot to characters. As I mentioned, this is from multiple perspectives, largely teen perspectives, and they're all related circumstantially. Abby and Luke are siblings, but Gavar and Bauda are skilled, so they have magic, and it's kind of, their lives intertwine, and so the story progresses well because their connection plays off each other well. As I mentioned in the story progression, Luke and Bauda were two of my favorite characters. I found them the most interesting, and they did the most plot work, in my opinion. Abby, I didn't really care for, and while Gavar was interesting, I didn't feel like he was really like a main plot device in this book. The characters themselves didn't feel truly dynamic in this book. I'm holding up hope that they will become deeper and more complex moving forward, but they're still a little bit more stereotyped here. And even though they do grow in some capacity, it's what is expected of people put in that situation, not necessarily just like natural growth. But I digress. It's something pretty minor. But I do really enjoy watching characters grow when I read a book. But this was pretty short and covered a short period of time. And so with this, I will move into my wrap-up, which is the last part of the spoiler-free portion of this video. This book I gave a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Overall, I did enjoy the experience quite a bit. I personally absolutely love political machinations and political intrigue, and there was quite a bit of that in this book from one of the perspectives, and I ate it up. I felt the characters were pretty bland. They weren't that dynamic, but there was the potential for them to become a lot more interesting as the series moves forward. I liked the world and the consistent exposure you had to the world building. There were no info dumps, and you learned about the world as the characters interacted with different parts of it, which I personally love as a writing tool, which is it helps avoid those egregious info dumps, which are the worst. And finally, my big issue with this, and the one that pulled me out the most in terms of my dislike, was the inconsistent pacing, moving from perspective to perspective. And while the story flowed well, the pace of the story didn't hold up as nicely. And with that, I am done here with the spoiler-free portion of my book review, and I will now move into my 6 book club questions, just to kind of give you a little more insight into what I thought. All right. The first question, what was your initial reaction? With the prologue, excitement. With the first chapter, concern. I was a little hesitant once the first chapter started, just because it was quite slow and I wasn't quite sure where the story was going to go and how I was going to feel about it. Question 2, what is your favorite chapter or scene? For me, first of all, as I mentioned, this is a spoiler section, but I'm going to reiterate it here. My favorite scene was Luke realizing that he's been a tool and not a rebellion. He's been a tool and not a rebel soldier. That scene for me was perfect. Question 3, how did the characters change throughout this book? Luke grew, and no one else really did. And I was a little disappointed in that. But the characters that didn't grow, I think, have the possibility for growth moving forward. It just wasn't their time to shine, so to speak. Question 4, how did you like the ending? For the first book in a series, I think the ending was really appropriate. You had a cliffhanger while also having some resolution. And the cliffhanger involved a lot of conflict and political intrigue, which are two things I enjoy reading about. Question 5, would you read more by this author? Heck yes, I fully intend to track down a copy of the second book in this series at some point, because I think it exists. I hope it exists. And then my 6th and final prompt, does this book remind you of any other books? Not so much in tone, but similar topic-wise and genre-wise. It actually made me think of Burn by Patrick Ness. Not so much because I felt like the overall tone of the stories was quite the same, but they both did alternate history with fantasy in such a way that it talked about really serious social issues and kind of navigating the impact of those social issues outside of how they're actually framed in real life. So it was really interesting. And while I can't necessarily say it's going to be a one-to-one, if you liked one, you'll like the other. But if you like one, you're probably going to be interested in the other one. And that's all I have to say today. So I will leave you here, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!